I have the high honor of talking about compost end uses. So we've been talking a lot all week about how to make compost, the processes involved in compost, and now we'll go a little deeper into how to use compost and what are its different applications. The purpose of today, we're going to talk about, kind of start with small scale uses of compost and then larger scale applications, understanding how, why, and when. We're going to talk about its application in potting soil, kind of in your garden, soil erosion, I just realized that's there twice, disease suppression, and also bioremediation. So, wanted to start off this talk, I think you can see the photo, just kind of this idea that compost is biodiversity. So the quote here says, when you use just chemical fertilizers, you're not establishing a long-lasting base of nutrition for the plant. It's just like giving it a huge piece of cake on Sunday, and then by Thursday, it's nutritionally starving. So we have the photo here of the like super processed funfetti cake, and then on the bottom, you see like your super diverse, nutritious superfood salad. And the purpose of starting with this and this imagery is just framing this in just the kind of idea that we'll be repeating throughout this talk, is just this concept that compost adds biodiversity to your soil. So we're all pretty familiar, I think Lynn mentioned it the first day, like our gut microbiome and our immune system, and we kind of are familiar with these ideas that like the more diverse inputs we have, the more kind of defense mechanisms we have to be able to defend ourselves against, you know, incoming viruses, diseases, etc. So compost, we're really talking about it in the same context. So the more diversity you have in your soil, the better prepared you are going to be for you know, any potential pathogens, etc. So kind of like we mentioned, compost services, one of the biggest things that we're focusing on is just its ability to diversify the soil food web. So we started talking about the soil food web on day one, the importance of just having all of these different players involved that'll strengthen in terms of micronutrients and then also microorganisms. And we kind of all know this. We love compost. We're here, so I won't go too much into detail, but just a little review, you know, increasing nutrients, improving the availability to uptake nutrients, as opposed to like a chemical fertilizer, which have their place sometimes, or, you know, organic fertilizers, more of the like isolates. But compost is more holistic. It supplies nutrients at a slow, steady pace as opposed to like a quick dose, increasing cation exchange, and then in the physical sense, just improves like the structure and the tilth of your soil. So, compost uses, starting this off by saying not all compost is created equal. So kind of this principle of like what goes in, goes out. All of us make compost in probably slightly different ways, and maybe all of our recipes are slightly different as well. So just keeping that in mind, that compost made under different conditions will produce compost with different qualities. Compost might vary in nutrients and be higher in bacteria or fungi. It might vary in its micro and macronutrients, and that's going to depend mostly on what you put in, so your initial recipe, your initial inputs, and then how long you spend the curing and maturation phase. So both of those areas are what's going to impact the kind of final result of your compost the most. So one way that you can just be super aware of what your compost has and what your soil has, you can get a soil test or get a compost test. One thing that LA Compost is going to begin to offer soon in the next month is community microscopy. I always have such a hard time with that word. Microscopy. And basically it's looking at your compost under a microscope, saying you kind of have this abundance of fungi, this type of bacteria, etc. So basically just getting a soil test of your garden so you know exactly what soil needs you have, and then also kind of having an understanding of what is within your compost so you can best match those two. And again, those can be done through traditional soil testing, or you can kind of look under a microscope and have somebody who knows about these sorts of things assess it for you. So when we're adding compost to the landscape, these are super generalizations, but trees typically prefer compost higher in fungi, and then your vegetables are going to prefer compost higher in bacteria. This is something that you can learn from a soil test and also just looking at under a microscope and kind of assessing the relative abundance of fungi versus bacteria. So vegetable garden. These are kind of just some practical hands-on tips. You guys might already know this, so it might be a review. Kind of two different ways that we add compost to the garden or to our soil or farm. When you're improving soil structure, so like maybe you're kind of double digging the first time, you can add compost like 12 to 18 inches deep, dig it in. That's like the traditional double digging style. Of course, that wouldn't be appropriate if you're doing like a no-till style. You could just do like a lasagna and then allow it to slowly percolate. But that's kind of like initial improving soil structure. Maybe you've already done your cover crop, etc. And you want to just kind of really improve the structure of the soil. So that you want to add the compost a little deeper. And then if you're just doing like seasonal nutrition, maybe you have like your garden and you're planting your tomatoes, you just put a little bit of compost, couple inches thick, and then scratch it around the surface. And then compost for trees, pretty much the same thing. Trees kind of get their nutrients around their base and like the drip line of the roots. So trying to keep it away from the crown so that you don't cause any rotting. But couple inch layer of compost around the tree, scratch it in, cover it with mulch so that you protect it and make sure that compost doesn't, move or blow away. Mulch has a lot of essential nutrients as well, just like straight up mulch, straight up, what do I try to say, leaves, sticks, etc. Just organic matter. So compost is great, but having a layer of mulch for those trees is really good. It's going to promote that long-lasting kind of slow release of nutrients. Okay, so another great way to use your compost in like a small scale setting is making a potting soil blend. So when we talk about the recipe of our potting soil blend, we're going to focus on kind of these 4 qualities. So the foundation of your potting blend is fertility, right? You want to make sure that there's enough fertility in your soil to support the growth of that plant beyond its germination phase. So fertility is kind of the base, and then you also want to have a balance of drainage, aeration, and water retention. So we're going to go into that in depth. So typically for fertility, especially today, and here we're going to talk about compost, but you can also use, there's a lot of different like dusts, powders, different ways that you can add nutrients to your potting blend in addition to compost. So thinking of compost as kind of the base, and then there's a lot of things you can add. Some of those things that you can add are like worm castings. So you want to use those in smaller amounts just because they're so rich in nutrients. They're like, they're denser in nutrients than just kind of typical windrow compost. And then in addition to those, you can add like a feather meal, blood meal, bone meal, kelp meal, rock dust. These are all other kind of just added nutrients that you can add. Aeration and drainage. Coarse sand is one that can, especially if you have super high clay soil, like really high clay content, like you have, you've probably filled a black bucket, I'm sure at some point with native soil, and it doesn't drain and it becomes like a brick. You need a little bit more drainage. So sand can help with that, like a coarse sand. You can use cocoa coir. That's like the byproduct of coconut, the husks. I didn't include peat moss because it's very controversial and not super sustainable, but that's sort of, cocoa coir is like an alternative, more sustainable version to peat moss, which you'll see a lot in potting soil recipes, so you can sub that out. And then leaf mulch, kind of just like underneath a tree, dig down a little bit, and you're going to have that kind of partially broken down, almost composted leaf mulch that'll also add nutrients and drainage, aeration qualities. And then finally, water retention, kind of same thing. We often grow plants in these like black pots that are just hot and dry out our soil. We got to come up with a better solution to that, right? But in the meantime, we're still using those pots. And so super important to have an element that is water retention. So I put perlite and vermiculite. Perlite also is a controversial input. It's not a super sustainable resource. So I also included vermiculite, bit more sustainable. They have the similar qualities, but typically perlite is what you're going to see like at the big box nurseries. You're probably all familiar with those little white balls in your plants, but both of these are great at water retention. Another way that you can use your compost is a compost tea. So if you have worm castings, you can use this for compost tea. You can also make compost tea just out of regular compost. Typically, it's made with worm casting just because it's so dense. When you have a vermicomposting system, usually pretty much always, unless you have a giant operation, the outputs are going to be much smaller quantities and much smaller volume than like your typical windrow system. So it's one way to make your worm castings last a long way. It's a good bang for your buck. So people always ask, I don't think we're gonna get that question here. You guys have probably all heard of compost tea, but they're like, what, you drink compost tea? So that's gonna be part of our demo. Everybody's gonna try the compost tea. Just kidding. Just kidding, it's for the plants, not for us. So compost tea, we're gonna do a demo of that, but essentially there's a few different ways to do it. We're gonna do the old school method, but you can also buy pumps. There's lots of different ways. It's essentially making a tea. You put your tea bag or even just like a handful of compost into a bucket. You fill it up with water, stir it up for quite a bit of time. Some people have a lot of different recipes. You can stir it for like multiple days to kind of maximize. Some people put in different like plant organic material to add nutrients. I've heard of like bananas, people put it in. So yeah, there's lots of different recipes, but kind of just the basic is to let it brew for like up to 48 hours, making sure to stir it so it doesn't go anaerobic. If you've not done that before, you'll know it's really gross, so you want to make sure to stir it. And then you can just pour the tea as like a foliar fertilizer. Okay, so we're gonna do a little demo now of making potting mixes. All right, so who here makes their own potting mixes with their compost? Cool, okay. So you guys probably have good suggestions too. And just so you know, like all of these that we're doing right now are one of many, many ways to make your potting mixes. We're just kind of giving you an idea of how to do it. So we're gonna start with our super basic mix. And when we say basic, that just means it can be used in a lot of different applications, and it's less buying of external things. Like I always, try to keep that permaculture principle of like using what you have and using what's on site. You don't need to go and buy a bunch of, things that you have to continue to buy. You can use what you have readily accessible. So our first recipe, we're gonna do our very basic mix, and we're gonna just do, you can get a scoop if you'd like. Obviously, there's many different vessels that you can use to scoop materials into another container, so not necessary, but it kind of feels cool. Okay, so I'm gonna take a scoop of, this is just regular windrow compost. So I'm gonna scoop this in. And then our next thing is cocoa coir. Sorry, this bag. No, that's okay, I did that. That was my fault. So this is cocoa coir. Again, it's like the husks of the cocoa. I feel like that scoop was a little bigger than the compost, but okay. And then we're gonna do a scoop of vermiculite. And you'll notice the vermiculite is a little bit smaller than the perlite, but both are gonna work really well. And then you just basically with your hands, if you want to, you can wear a glove, but we all like getting that soil under our nails. And so this is like our extremely basic potting mix. So we can pass this around if you like. Yeah. So you can feel it, touch it. Cool. All right, so now we're gonna do our super mix. And what that means is basically our basic mix, but next level. We're a little fancy this time. Okay, so we're gonna do the same thing. Scoop of compost. I'm like, what does my recipe say? Scoop of, oh yeah, it's the basic mix. So scoop of cocoa coir. And we're gonna do another scoop of vermiculite. And I'm just gonna mix those base ingredients together so I kind of have my basic mix. And when you feel that, engage with it, squeeze it, it's super spongy, it feels really good. I'm enjoying feeling it right now. And then we're gonna do some worm castings. Where did my worm castings go? They're like in this weird bag. Worm castings, again, are really strong and potent. So in comparison to the scoop, I'm just gonna do like a very small handful. You could do a little more. I'm kind of feeling extra fancy. Okay. And then let's get some fish bone meal. So this is another kind of just added value. Do you have anything special to say about fish bone meal, Lynn?
It's kind of more of a high phosphorus amendment, but it also has nitrogen in it. So sometimes, like our compost sometimes tests to be pretty high phosphorus, so we don't necessarily need to add it all the time. But if you don't have like phosphorus in your soil, it helps to add bone meal. And also, you know, bone meal consists a lot of calcium, which is good for your soil as well. So other nutrients are in there as well.
Whoa! Okay, do that different next time. Half of it blew away. Okay, so we're mixing that in, and then it did like blew in your face, sorry. Here's some bone meal for you. And then for this one, we're gonna add, do I have sand? Yeah, we're just gonna add, oh no, I don't. I have that for the succulent mix. Oh.
Wait, can you remind us what vermiculite is?
It's like a silicate rock. I think it's like yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's volcanic. It's like a volcanic silicate rock. And I'm gonna add a little bit of extra sand in here because I'm gonna put seedlings in it, and so I want it to have super duper drainage. Okay, and then the last thing for my super mix is just a little bit of organic matter. Sorry, I should have labeled all these bags. Okay, and basically what this organic matter is going to do is just add a little bit extra like pieces of kind of like wood. They're very small, so they're like ground up. It's not going to be too big, but it just adds a little bit of extra organic matter. Okay, so that's our super duper mix. We can pass that around now, and then we'll do the last one, succulent.
Oh, do you want to add any rock dust to that? Or?
Oh, yeah. What? Yeah, we forgot that one. Okay, we're gonna make this super duper.
Let's charge it up.
We're gonna charge this up. Yeah.
So rock dust is like trace minerals. This is an azomite, which I guess is from like Utah or like the Southwest. It kind of has special properties. Can I borrow the mic?
Oh yeah.
So there's different types of rock dust that come from different parts, different places. This is azomite, which is, yeah, as I mentioned, like from like Utah and the Southwest kind of area. So it has a certain kind of mineralogy, maybe a little bit more iron in it because of that. There's also like basalt rock dust, which just comes from like volcanic areas and is like a volcanic origin. There's also like glacial rock dust, which I'm not exactly sure where that's from, but I assume it's from like glacial deposits. So it has like, you know, different kind of mineralogy based on that. So you can play around with the different types of rock dust, but they all kind of basically provide trace minerals for your plants. It's not something you want to add like too much of because it can like kind of contribute to like hydrophobic kind of conditions in the soil. So you just want to add a little bit. So we're gonna do a little sprinkle here.
So probably less than I put. I put 0.25, and I'll do like maybe half of that, based on what Lynn just told me. We adapt. Cool. This one smells a little fishier.
Yummy.
All right. So you guys can pass this one around. You don't have to do it. We'll just real quick do our succulent mix. And the only reason we wanted to do this is, number one, everybody loves succulents these days. People grow them. And it's really just to contrast that, you know, those last two mixes are much higher in nutrient focus. And so this next mix is going to be much lower nutrients just because succulents don't want it and don't need it. So we don't need to waste our precious fertile resources on that. So for this one, we're going to actually do perlite just to show you guys a different example. This is like really white, so it's a little bit different than that vermiculite. And then we're going to do a scoop of sand. So already starting a bit different. We're going to do quite a bit of cocoa core. I think it's supposed to, it's supposed to say 0.5. I think it's supposed to say 0.5. I'm like trying to read my recipe. And then just 1 part of compost. And then this one just has 1 part of compost to all those other things. Put too much compost in.
Perlite versus vermiculite.
What's that?
How do you know when to use perlite versus
They have very similar qualities. So a lot of people just have a preference in terms of like what they want to use and what's available to them. So it's really kind of, I think, more sourcing, and then if you want to choose that, you know, maybe I think vermiculite might be a little bit more pricey than perlite. Like perlite's a bit more readily accessible, but as we know, things that are cheaper, there's usually a cost elsewhere. So you can pay a little bit more for vermiculite that might be more sustainable. In terms of like use, do you think there's a huge difference?
I don't think there's a huge difference. You might notice that the perlite is a little bit larger in size.
Yeah.
And the vermiculite is smaller, so that's going to kind of facilitate a little bit more aeration and drainage. But I think they both retain moisture similarly.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Lynn. Does this look good, or should we add?
That looks nice.
Okay, cool.
Do you guys know if you can get vermiculite in different sizes like perlite?
It's usually really tiny.
Much smaller,
tiny
yeah.
particles.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We want super perlite-y.
It's kind of like, I mean, there's not a ton of like fresh organic matter in it, so it's gonna be pretty stable for a little bit. After you've like planted seeds and grown plants in it, it'll kind of be spent. You can kind of reuse it and try to keep growing stuff in it, but you can easily like kind of amend it with compost, if you know, to kind of recharge it and reuse it again. Or you can kind of take all of your spent potting mixes and like just mix in some new materials, so that way you don't have to completely remake your potting mix. Many people also just like throw their old potting mix into the compost, but I think it's great to reuse it so you don't have to keep buying new material, as much new materials all the time.
The seed starting mix, just to like kind of highlight and identify, we added a bit more sand and a bit more vermiculite to that one, just to make sure that we have a lot of drainage in those like tiny cells or in a pot. So that's kind of the key difference, is that when you're seed starting, you just want to make sure that there's lots of drainage so that and water holding, so that it stays wet during germination period.
Probably these mixes would work well for trees as well, and if you had a more fungally oriented compost. Mulch is also really great for trees. They'll really appreciate kind of that carbon resource.
We're not going to make the compost tea because we don't have a hose right here. But this is basically your setup. This is the most basic, easy setup. You can buy very expensive pumps and compost tea setups and all that stuff. If you're into it, do it. But literally all you need is a $5 5-gallon bucket. This is a little fancier. We have a little burlap bag, and it's like our tea bag. Just makes it so we don't have to filter it at the end. Awesome, thank you. And so this is filled with worm castings. Again, like we mentioned before, you can also just do regular compost, but this is worm castings. You're gonna put it in the bottom of your bucket. If you don't have a little burlap bag, there's so many other things. You could use like a coffee filter, you could use tons of other, you know, even like a fabric that's really porous, or you can just throw it in and filter it afterwards. So put it in your bucket. You would fill it up pretty much like all the way, maybe leave like a couple inches at the top, just so when you're stirring it doesn't splash all over you. You're gonna fill up that bucket all the way to the top, and then you're gonna go for like a really like witchy, stirring the cauldron vibe, and just like stir it up. I recommend doing it for like a good amount of time, at least like 5 minutes, or as long as your arm can handle it, but making sure it really gets mixed in at first. And then you want to let it sit for pretty much up to 48 hours. And it's recommended like maybe in the morning, give it a stir. In the afternoon, give it a stir, just so it doesn't go anaerobic. it can get really smelly and gross, and then you're going to regret starting this project to begin with. So just keep stirring it. Let it go for 48 hours. It's really as simple as that. If you use the pump model, it's basically just like an in-water pump. So you'd put it at the bottom and leave it going for that 48 hours. Then you don't have to stir it. But that's pretty much it. If you didn't use a tea bag, you can filter it. I usually don't because it kind of typically settles at the bottom. And then you can either pour it into like a, hand watering vessel. Some people have like fertigation systems where you can just go straight through your drip lines. You could go get a backpack sprayer, put it in, use it as like a foliar application. So lots of great ways to use compost tea. Maybe after this, when we get the water together, we'll do a demo so you guys can check it out throughout the day. But that's sort of your basic recipe. We have that compost tea recipe, and like I said, this actually is on the LA Compost website if any of you guys are wanting that recipe, but we'll also send out this presentation so you'll have a copy of that. Let's go a little bit more into, now we're going to talk about large-scale applications. So we're going to breeze through this one. So we're going to start with soil erosion. So probably a lot of you all are very familiar with this issue. It's most likely the reason that you're here. According to the USDA, the U.S. loses more than 2 billion tons of topsoil through erosion each year. Part of why we compost is to build our compost, build that carbon sink into the soil. So soil erosion is a huge issue and one that I would assume everybody is aware of. I chose this photo. It's a very eroded area, actually where a wildfire happened in California. Only to say that, our soil erosion issue is bad now as wildfires increase. We're going to be dealing with these issues ongoing. So definitely one to be aware of, especially here in California where we have so much agriculture and also so much natural resource loss happening right now. Quick review of soil erosion, just kind of in relation to soil science. One of the most couple of the more significant ones is that splash erosion. So just when water hits the soil, if there's no protective covering, if there's no mulch, kind of like that awesome demo we did on Monday that showed just like how much the mulch kind of filtrates it and allows the soil to percolate as opposed to just like hit it and splash off. So splash erosion is super damaging to soil, especially when there's no cover. And then like your rill and sheet erosion happen more like on a slope or where there's water. You have a lot of water movement. It's carrying a lot of sediment to other parts. And then your rill erosion, you guys have probably all seen like a slope, and it kind of creates like a serious indent as the water moves down and really kind of creates like a scar on that soil. So these are just the main kinds of soil erosion we're thinking about. What's the connection? Compost supports the stabilization of soil and it promotes plant growth. So this photo is basically showing like bare soil with a huge rill going down the middle of it. On the left side, you have like a seeded compost, and then on the right side, they applied compost only, just basically showing the potential impacts that you can have on a super eroded area if you add compost. Not only does it stabilize the soil, but it also promotes vegetative growth, and the roots of that growth are going to hold the soil in better and prevent a lot of that wind, splash, or rill erosion. So this is just like a long list of basically everything I just said. Increasing water filtration, reducing runoff, and actually like reducing the amount of sediment that you're moving through water erosion. You're increasing and improving plant growth, the soil cover. You're increasing the water holding capacity of the soil, which can help to reduce the runoff. You're kind of helping with just the soil structure, the soil pH, and supporting that vegetation establishment. And it alleviates soil compaction just by kind of improving that soil structure. So one of the really interesting methods of using compost, in especially a slope setting, are these compost filter berms. So it's basically berms built on contour, so like looking at the land and knowing where kind of your dips and turns are. And what it does, you can see in this image to the bottom, this is like the compost berm, it's that little lump. You have the water coming down, and so what happens is the compost berm not only kind of filtrates the water and the sediment that's coming down, so it's going to hold some of the material that wants to move, but it's also going to just hold onto it and slow down the spread. So one of those kind of sayings that we have, like slow it, spread it, sink it. So these compost filter berms are going to slow the flow of water. It's going to kind of be able to be absorbed in the compost and then be able to be sunk as opposed to just going down a slope. We're actually doing this at one of our sites in sort of a way that we're composting on a slope, and we're going to build a bunch of piles, and they're actually going to not only act as compost filter berms, but they're going to also be active compost piles. So we'll let you know how that goes. Thank you. Another cool way is a compost blanket. So I know I wish I had just like a giant tube that I could like spray compost everywhere, right? Or mulch. That'd be so cool. We were talking about superpowers earlier. So anyways, compost blanket is basically just a super large scale spreading of compost, right? So we put compost blankets on our, farms or gardens. This is basically just like a larger scale. It's used a lot in like Department of Transportation projects, like side of the freeway areas where there's just really bad erosion. They kind of make a whole compost blanket. Not only does it sort of help to hold the water holding capacity, the soil structures, etc., but really promotes that vegetative growth, which I see all the time, those freeway projects happening, and they should use more compost. Okay, cool. So then compost socks. This is another pretty cool method. Basically, it's a mesh-filled tube. They're called compost socks. You fill it with compost. You basically kind of place it like in a way that's going to prevent that sheet flow runoff. So again, not only does it filter any sediment that's coming down, that compost, just like the organic material inside of the compost, is going to have a holding capacity for that sediment. It's going to do a little bit of filtration. It's going to prevent the water from flowing any further. And then, we've talked a lot about slopes, but compost helps with all erosion. Even flat land can benefit from compost. I know that maybe some of you guys took like the 5 coming down here, perhaps, to get to LA, and you see all those farms, and I always feel like, there's like no coverage, right? And I just imagine all that wind erosion just constantly is blowing away the topsoil. So, it's always really exciting when you pass by a farm that's like kind of got a little richer structure. And what that does by adding compost, it acts like a sponge, it holds water, and then it's going to prevent the wind and the splash erosion in a rain event. Yeah. And then managing runoff. Kind of mentioned that a lot, but just the ability for compost to actually filter the water and prevent the pesticide, the agricultural chemicals, all that sort of runoff. It can act as actually an organic biofilter. Okay, so disease suppression. The main thing that we want to focus on today is the fact that compost can suppress disease in 2 key ways, and that's what we're going to talk about. So first, during the thermophilic composting process, and then second, during the application to a growing system. So we've talked a lot about this importance of heat in our compost pile. It's super important that all parts of the pile get that hot heat. Several factors are known to contribute to the eradication of plant pathogens and nematodes during composting. The most significant is heat. So heat during the composting process kills a large type of weed seeds and pathogens. Not all, obviously, but for the most part, a lot of those pathogens are going to be kind of killed and broken down during the high temperatures. So with that said, your compost pile must reach up to 140 degrees. That's like the pathogen killing level. And it must maintain that PRFP. So staying at 140 degrees, you need to turn it 3 times so you get all of those parts of the pile that hot. And then you also must keep it moist. The moisture actually contributes to maintaining that heat. Maybe when you're compost problem solving, we all know a high carbon dry compost is going to kind of cool down. So making sure that it stays wet is going to make sure that you maintain those high temperatures. So thermophilic composting can kill pathogens as long as you maintain that PFRP. Studies are showing that a diverse consortia of microbes can be more affected towards disease and pathogen suppression than traditional and isolated bacteria fungi treatment. So we have a photo of like the soil food web, and I wanted to show this photo because just how we kind of started this presentation talking about the importance of biodiversity in your soil. So when you have a strong and diverse, healthy soil food web, you're going to have like all of these different players able to contribute to fighting off any disease or pathogen that comes, right? So this is like your team that's helping you keep your plants healthy and your soil healthy. With that said, the soil microorganisms play a key role in crop protection and improving soil suppressiveness. You know, diverse systems mean diverse defense mechanisms. So one thing that's really fascinating is kind of just the way that bacteria and microorganisms communicate with each other. There's so much more to be known, and I'm just scratching the surface, but kind of thinking it in a way that when a certain pathogen comes in, there is a trigger response. You know, these bacteria are evolved to kind of know and understand their environment, what's around them. And so, you know, this photo kind of shows like a really angry microbe coming in, and this guy's like defending itself, you know, so defends itself, it sends a message to all the other bacteria that are its kind, and they all kind of rise up and kind of start fighting it off. So that's one way that compost can contribute to your diverse soil food web, having a lot of different microorganisms that create that trigger response when a pathogen comes in and kind of be able to mobilize and either break it down or whatever. Additionally, decomposition activity, so like the decomposition process can produce different antifungals and antivirals. So just by adding compost, you have a better chance of adding those sort of natural antivirals into your system. I want to put this slide too, promising improvements, still a lot of need for research. One of the things that researchers have found is that these sort of interactions are not binary. It's not like, oh, my compost has this microorganism and my soil has this pathogen, and great, I found a perfect solution. It's actually more about the community and more about the interactions as opposed to like this binary, you know, antagonist or pathogen and antagonist. So effectiveness varies. It's dependent on the inputs. It's dependent on the existing soil web food community and obviously the disease present. So just kind of like reading through a lot of the research, they've found certain relationships, and you know, they've also found that just this community can't really narrow it down to one specific microorganism, but it's really just this diversity that supports the whole. So that was disease suppression. Just a quick review. Can suppress diseases during the thermophilic process, and you can also support disease suppression just by adding compost to your soil and increasing the diversity of your soil food web. Compost and bioremediation. Bioremediation, it's a term that we hear a lot. Basically, it means using biological treatments to help clean up hazardous materials in the environment. I put this picture here because I hear a lot about mycoremediation. It's basically the use of fungi to decompose. This one is from Paul Stamets, who did an experiment using fungi to decompose petroleum, so like gasoline. And then I also have this quote here that says, bacteria are the most nutritionally diverse of all organisms, meaning they can eat almost anything. So I wanted to put those two there because, like we just kind of reviewed, bacteria and fungi are the primary decomposers of compost. So just knowing those two have this huge potential to eat and break down kind of gives us a clue to say, okay, compost might have this benefit too. Compost bioremediation has proven effective in degrading or altering many types of contaminants, chlorinated and non-chlorinated hydrocarbons, wood-preserving chemicals, solvents, heavy metals, pesticides, petroleum, and explosives like TNT, which blew my mind. I did not know this, but they've done quite a lot of research in this compost bioremediation area, looking at how we can actually decompose and process these chemicals and these types of materials that otherwise are causing, you know, a big harm to their native environment. So I didn't include this in the presentation, but I'm just going to say this, like some of these methods, they call them in situ. So it basically means like treating the problem at the source. And then other methods are like ex situ, which basically means like taking that contaminated soil or contaminated material and doing it elsewhere. For the most part, when we're talking about compost and bioremediation, it's ex situ. So it's actually removing that soil and putting it into a system. There's a lot of different compost-assisted bioremediation techniques, ranging from biological to extremely engineered. We're going to focus on two very biological methods. Okay, so Windrow bioremediation, really the same principle that we just covered with the disease suppression. Heat kills things. Windrow bioremediation uses the thermophilic process to degrade plant pollutants. Sorry, that was hard. The contaminants are digested, metabolized, and transformed by microorganisms into humus and inert byproducts. So this is kind of a hard image to show, but it's basically just showing, like, this was from an experiment, remediation of highly fuel oil contaminated soil by food waste composting. So they actually did like petroleum, what am I trying to say? Contaminated area. They basically used food scraps, mature compost, and sawdust. They did it in, and what happens in that process is those contaminants can actually be digested in very specific conditions with a specific recipe into that process. So biostimulation, this is, so instead of putting our compost into a thermophilic system and using that heat and that microorganismal activity to break it down, this is more of a kind of easier and less invasive way. It's also going to be a much longer process. So I know that we've mentioned like phytoremediation. It's kind of similar in that it's going to take a few times to, grow your plant, let those plants collect the contaminants, and then dispose of them and do it a few more times. So this biostimulation process, again, is not going to be the most direct, but it is a promising way of being able to use compost to sort of support the breaking down of these contaminants. So it's basically using this principle of, providing, again, that diverse soil populations, food web populations, to support the metabolization, volatilization, and degradation of the contaminants. So just by kind of adding those materials, you're adding more life into your soil and breaking it down. Obviously, if you have like a super contaminated site and you want to grow vegetables there, you can't just like add compost and make it better. I want to make that clear. But there are ways that they're finding this sort of kind of biostimulation by essentially adding life into really depleted soils can over time support the breaking down of those contaminants.